Yeah, so Oriana will be speaking with you all today about her experience and her time, I'm sure, at Whitman and give lots of tips and insight. She is a graduate of Whitman with a degree in finance and also from the School of Arts and Sciences with a degree in economics. So we're very happy to have her here, and I'll just turn it over. Go right ahead.
All right. Everybody can hear me well, right? Okay, cool. So hello from Montreal. I've escaped New York City temporarily, hopefully. But I'm in Montreal. I've been here since mid-March, and I'm hoping to go back home soon. Hopefully everybody's safe at home. So I'm going to chat about essential skills. I think the long title was something like essential skills for being successful in different industries, but we've shortened it to essential skills for today. So I'll give you guys a little bit of background on myself and probably MTOR, the startup I currently run. So life after Syracuse. So I did graduate in 2012. I was a Whitman grad dual with arts and sciences. As Allison mentioned, I studied economics and finance. I actually minored in the I school as well. And I was an Orange Valley Fund analyst for the 2 years of the program, selecting and investing some of the capital that Whitman has there. I focused mostly on oil and gas and like industrials. So it's an interesting way to start learning about fundamental finance. I moved to New York after graduating to work for JP Morgan. I interned with them for a while before graduating. I started off in their private wealth management group, where I was on a trading desk for ultra high net worth individuals for about a year. Then I moved to their investment banking side, where I was covering convertible bonds and equity derivatives. So esoteric financial structures, issuing those for big corporations. And then my last role at JP Morgan before leaving in 2016 was working inside the financial institutions group in something called specialty finance. And so for those of you that are familiar with investment banking, there's industry coverage groups where you help companies in that industry, specifically in financial institutions. You might help insurance companies or banks. Specialty finance was more of the, they would call it the land of lost toys of financial institutions. So it was all these strange companies that made money with money in creative ways, such as fintech. So companies that do loans online or other startups that are doing basically bridging the gap that banks can't these days because of regulation. So I was working with a lot of those companies back in 2016. I left JP Morgan to get my master's in computer science at Columbia. So I got a master's in machine learning, which is closely related to data science. It's sort of like being a statistician on steroids, doing a lot of work in modeling things, modeling and forecasting. It's related to econometrics as well. So it's a pretty good fit for me, along with the fundamental computer science knowledge that I was looking to further. I graduated in 2017 and I joined MTOR full-time as a chief operating officer. MTOR was born in 2016 and I followed the company sort of unofficially for about a year until I joined full-time, joined my co-founder and his project on a full-time basis in 2017. That is actually next Monday will mark 3 years since I took on that role. So I guess we'll do a little contrast to compare, because I imagine some of you may work in or maybe contemplating sort of more corporate life versus startup life. They're very different. They have good things and maybe not so good things, or it depends a lot on, I think, your personality, what you're looking for in terms of experience. So I guess Wall Street versus Silicon, Valley Alley, as it's known in New York. So I started off in JP Morgan, which is a very structured way of working. There's always the right way to do things. There's training. You usually, when you join a major corporation, you go to some sort of boot camp or training for a few months. That's a big deal in banking, but I do know that consulting firms will do that in other companies as well. You have a schedule, a manager, you're sort of shielded by your senior people. When you're, entry level, you do something and then the next person checks it and the next person checks it. And so lots of checks and balances. Banking is pretty intense. So it is crazy, it is intense. So it will be busier than maybe a more normal corporate job. But the last bullet, won't go bankrupt. JP Morgan probably isn't going anywhere for a while. It's very different to working at a startup, right? So MTOR is 4 years old. It's chaotic. Everything you do is best efforts. Nobody's really written a guide for when you're starting something new. You kind of make it up as you go. There's really no boss, at least I guess in my position, but in general, startups tend to be much more free form and flat hierarchies. They're smaller teams. We're fully remote, which was much more special about 3 months ago, but now it's sort of the reality of all of our existence. But we've been fully remote for a long time. A lot of our team members came from working fully remotely for most of their careers, actually. So no schedule, but there is sort of a natural schedule that emerges. Most people will work somewhat a bit of a routine and try to overlap with their team members on the most part. So it is the 9 to 5, but with a lot of flexibility in a way. You have to be very accountable. Everything you do has to be your best work, and you have to be responsible for it because there aren't that many people to be able to check everything that you do. At a startup, we're about 50 people. So in this case, I think it's a little more accelerated, where 1 week is more like 6 months of a corporate job, where a lot of things happen and change very quickly. And the hours could be crazy. They're a little more fun, I think, in my humble opinion, it's more of a still not bankrupt. With startups, you never know. It's a tough environment and things change, and you tend to be much more fragile than a big institution. So that's the difference. So the transition from, how do you make this transition from something so structured to something chaotic where there's a way to do things, no boss, no schedule? Grad school is actually a good way to do that leap. In grad school, nobody's really checking on you. Sort of chaotic, no schedule, no boss. Nobody really is gonna care if you did your homework or not. It's really on you. So working remotely, sort of being very like self-driven and working independently is a big part of graduate schools. I think that sort of was very helpful in making that change. So this is MTOR. What is MTOR? So MTOR is a automated background check company. So we provide background checks, data intelligence, compliance in something as quick as instant, a couple seconds, in 8 different countries, mostly serving companies in the technology industry, but also some more traditional companies, like we're working on supplying some banks with automated compliance. We're just under 50 people. We've been 50 up and down a little bit. We're fully distributed, so we are in 10 different countries. A lot of engineering and product, but also a lot of lawyers. We don't define ourselves as legal tech, but in a way we're very close to that. Some sales team members, and then the rest we have HR, we have finance, we have project management, and then leadership and senior leadership and managers as well. This is just a quick summary of what we do. So we have our own databases. We connect with government sources and different search systems. It's all available via an API, which clients can just get access to and integrate into their own systems. So we've been serving technology firms. We operate in Latin America. We've been around since 2016. So these are some of our clients. So Uber was our first client. We started working with them June 2016. Didi is our biggest client. They're the Uber of China. They're not in the States, but they are massive globally, and so we work with them. Rappi is a delivery company, sort of like Seamless. Cabify and Beat are like Uber, and then the other ones are a mixture of companies that do things like gig economy, like a TaskRabbit, or companies lending online. So what does a COO do? It's a bit of a strange job, because it will be different in almost every company, at least a little bit. Um, I've put it in here, it's a choose your own adventure kind of job. It really is, once you are in a bigger, when you start off, you do everything. And then as you grow, you'll start delegating some things. But there's really no strict definition of what a COO does. And so in my version of it, I suppose, is been picking and choosing some of my favorite things or things that I knew how to do well enough. And I've held on to those and either delegated others, or my co-founder will do them. So my version includes raising capital and investor relations. I have a phantom job here that's the CFO role, which I also hold, but I don't really use that title. I do finance, budgeting, accounting, contracts, legal. I negotiate with clients. I also created the HR, the talent and culture function within our company. So creating culture, the employee experience, and hiring is also part of what I've done. Business development, client management, sales. I haven't been doing sales myself a whole lot, but I do manage the administration of sales. And so metrics, how many calls have our sales reps had in a week, how many of those are getting answers, and tracking and implementing systems around that. It's a very, I guess, if anything, a COO is a very process-oriented, organizing kind of role, more than anything else. And then other things like special initiatives and project management I do. In our case, operations is not under me. It's a misnomer in our particular case. Operations for our company is very closely tied to the product, because what we do has a manual review component. And so the operations team is actually is closely tied to the product and technology. And actually my co-founder is responsible for the ops team. So I don't know if there's any questions until now. That was a lot of information. And I know that some people are sometimes curious about Wall Street or startups. And so if there's any questions until then, I think this could be a good little stopping point.
Yeah, if anyone has.
As long as you're not correcting what I said, we're good to go.
Oriana, I have a question.
Yeah.
So what about the difference of Wall Street and that area having so much history versus starting new? How does that relate to maybe making like career choices?
Yeah, I think Wall Street or any major corporation gives you this sort of really good professional education. I think is pretty important. I think when you go to a startup, you don't have that credibility. When you're at like a big company like JP Morgan, you'll just show up and email a client or show up to a meeting, and you immediately will get the meeting, will have credibility. Whereas with a startup, you have to hack away at it. For us, we were lucky, but also the way we built this company, we had Uber as an anchor client, and that's given us a lot of credibility in the market. Being able to say that we've worked with them for 4 years at this point has been pretty important. But I think when it comes to building a career, starting off, it depends a little bit on your personality, frankly. But I think the benefits of starting off at a corporation is you learn how to work really well, just because there's so much structure and there's so many right ways to do things, which you may or may not agree with at the end of the story, but then it does give you all these good habits and things that you can carry somewhere else and have a good way of working and good practices. Even just prioritizing how to create good quality work, how to work with in a very managerial focused environment, and then maybe how that can be different if you go to a flatter organization. So I think those are some of the differences, and there is a benefit to doing both. I think if you start your career off in a startup, you will learn a lot of things very quickly, but you will not have anybody to teach them to you. You'll just kind of have to self-learn. So if you are a very independent, self-learning personality and you want to be more of a generalist until you maybe later on find what you really like, maybe a startup is an interesting way to go on. One of our team members who works with us part-time, who's a student, has unintentionally done a bit of a rotation program inside MTOR. He started doing operations and he was helping with some finance stuff. Then he worked for a long time under the project management function, and now he's supporting the sales team. So in 2 years he's been with us, he's learned almost every aspect of what it is to run the company, and that's something you wouldn't necessarily obtain working at a corporation.
Thank you. That's great.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. Any other questions? If not, we can go on. Okay, so producing effective work. One of the biggest things, and then maybe this is just coming from banking, but attention to detail is pretty significant. It's one of those, it's something that gives you, gives everything that you do credibility. It really shows that you care, but it also puts you into the habit of focusing on what you're doing and making sure you've actually understood the task. And so I think when it comes to creating effective work and building trust with the people that you work with, be it your managers, be it your clients, attention to detail is pretty fundamental, I think. And this is also coming from finance, but the classic example is there is a pitch book with a typo or with the name of another company. And so it really, no matter how good the analysis is that you've presented, the minute that the client or whoever's seeing what you produced notices that you have another client or a typo, all the other work immediately loses credibility, because it opens up questions of how much did this person care about what I was doing. So I think there's always something to be said for going over everything you do really carefully, showing it to somebody. Even now, even though I'm one of the most senior people at my company, almost everything I produce or write will be seen by somebody else. Sometimes it's my co-founder, but that's not always the case. I have an analyst who is a JD MBA, and he reviews almost everything I write, and will question it. And I think that's a really good practice to make sure that what you're sending out externally or communicating to your team is of good quality and makes sense to a third party. So I think attention to detail is a really good skill that you will need almost in every job. If you're in sales, right, making sure you connect with a company and the emails you send and the conversations you have incorporate details of needs and questions and troubles that the client may have, is important. If you're doing more of a research job, attention to detail will be super important, because you'll be maybe crunching some numbers, reviewing some analysis, and so it will be important in that role as well. Then the opposite side of attention to detail, but also important, is getting the big picture. If you don't have a sense of the context of what you're doing and what it's for and how it fits into the larger narrative of your company, it'll be hard to understand or really fulfill the purpose of the work that you're doing. And so one of the things that we try to teach some of our team members is to think systemically and think, what is the why of what I'm building? Why does this matter? Who is it for? Because anybody can take instructions and anybody can sort of jot down a couple of requirements and put something out there. But then what's really valuable is when you've taken a step back to understand the audience of a presentation, understand how this will be helpful to whoever's receiving it, be it a manager or a client. And that'll give you the ability to probably make it more precise and more useful to whoever is receiving it. And so how do you do that? It's a tough skill to develop, and especially when you're starting off your career, but it's a combination of asking for context, thinking about what you're doing, and why it matters, who you're giving it to, how does it relate to other things you've done, and always asking a lot of questions of your manager. I think when you get some sort of project, I think companies, and I think it's if you're in a work environment where you're not allowed to ask why you're doing something, then maybe that's a troublesome work environment, and that's a fair thing to realize, that maybe your job doesn't allow for you to get that context, because it'll just be tougher to do your job. It'll be tougher for your team to do well if you can't obtain that sort of information, because it's a matter of being able to contribute much more productively. So I think those are they're kind of on opposite ends, but zooming out of what you're doing and not just doing a task will be really valuable in almost any work context. The other one, taking initiative. I think it's, when you start off, it feels like you're just being given tasks and then you follow the task. But what will help you be successful in a team and with a manager is, how can you be proactive and anticipate other needs and other things that your company or team might require. And so taking initiative, first of all, shows that you want to be more invested and you maybe want to take on more interesting work. It also opens the possibility for being given new responsibilities that could be more interesting to you. And so we've had different team members who've changed jobs a couple of times. Our company is not really that old, but we've had most of our team stick around for a very long time. And I think part of why they've stuck around is because they've had the opportunity to learn new things very often. And so I mentioned one of our junior team members who's already worked in like 4 different organizations. But then one of our more senior team members came on as a software engineer, but he was also getting his law degree. And so he was doing some engineering work, and then he raised his hand and said, hey, I actually understand all the legal stuff behind this product. I can help you guys craft that. And then suddenly he became more of a product manager. And then he kept raising his hand and saying like, hey, I can help manage the operations people that work in this product. And then he sort of became more of like a team manager for that country. And then, you know, it's been 2.5 years later, he's actually the 3rd most senior person at the company after my co-founder and I, and manages a giant unit inside our company, which is MTOR Brazil. And so he has something like 15 people working in his team. And so he's the sort of vice president of that, of MTOR Brazil, and he oversees about $1 million budget for that unit. He oversees the engineering that goes into the product. He oversees operations and accounting and legal and all the HR functions, and interacts with the client as well. So he grew into a GM, like a general manager role over the course of 2.5 years, by just kind of raising his hand and saying like, I'm interested in doing this. This sounds cool. I'd like to learn about this. And so I think, and that he would have never gotten there had he not said, hey, this is interesting to me. I have ideas on how I can make this better. So again, seeing it at MTOR is very micro, but it is transitions that people, it is a set of transitions that you could do at other jobs as well. The other one's being resourceful. I think it's about being creative in solving problems and knowing that you can kind of take that initiative to be proactive and find things that might be useful or helpful, reaching out to people you know for advice, Googling, really being able to take in knowledge that you need to be able to solve a problem or help somebody else solve a problem is also fundamental in creating work, because sometimes work you will get will be very ill-defined. I see this with my analyst. It also is sort of his personality, but he works very closely with me. And when we hired him, we told him that his job description was no job description. He was just going to do all these weird random projects that I had. And since my job description is so broad, so would his. And so he was up for that challenge. And so a lot of the work that he gets is like, hey, I just saw this law come through. I don't know what it's about. I don't know when it comes into effect. Just read about it. Let me know and see how it impacts us. So there's like no direction there. It's really just, I saw this thing, help me out and see if we need to care about it. And so what is being resourceful? Being resourceful is going out and looking at the statute, going out and maybe reaching out to other law firms that might have white papers on whatever came out, reaching out to our company's counsel and having a conversation with them to see what their perspective is. Think about how that impacts the business. Maybe it is like a cybersecurity compliance thing, so he should probably speak to our engineers and see if we're complying already or not. And so have the ability to go around and collect information from multiple places is a really important skill set in being very helpful and very effective. Any questions up until there? Okay, so working with others. Working with others is tough. Many of you may have experienced that in group projects, in core, in capstone if you're seniors, where you're sort of assigned randomly. You're maybe quote unquote stuck with team members and you have a lot of work to do and it's hard to distribute the work and communicate and motivate. And so working with others does not ever cease. I think it just gets bigger as time goes by, unless you have some sort of job that's very dependent on yourself. But even then, you're probably, you know, even if you're just a freelancer and you work on your own, you're working with clients or something. So it'll be hard to find a job where you're not exposed to other people. So working with others is challenging, and over time, it requires building a lot of empathy and good communication skills and understanding yourself as well. I think when you start off a career, looking for feedback and learning how to receive feedback is pretty important. You know, there won't be grades in the real world. There will just be like performance evaluations. The problem at a lot of companies is that those performance reviews are done at the end of the year, like when, you know, it's been a whole year and then you just get some, you know, 25-minute review from your manager in December, and maybe you'll get a bonus or like a grade, and that's it. And a whole year of going without feedback is a very long time. You will have no notion of if you're doing good or bad work up until then, which is not a good way to manage your career, right? It would be easier in school, right? The whole semester, you're getting grades every couple of weeks, you know, throughout the whole experience of being in university, you have a sense of what's going on. So can you imagine going a whole year or 2 years without really knowing how you did in school or in classes, and then just getting a surprise, you know, GPA at the end, and having had no way to control that or improve that? So not asking for feedback and not learning how to receive it is very similar. It's like going a whole year or 2 years blindly and then being surprised, and maybe you got a good grade, maybe you didn't. And in some cases that has really very real impact, promotions, bonuses, whether you're put on new projects. And so when you start a new job, it's very important that you get time with your manager often, that you ask for feedback, that you learn how to take that feedback constructively, even if you don't like what you hear. And asking for coaching and mentoring as well. A lot of people ask, you know, we'll talk about get a mentor, get a coach. I think finding somebody who, aside from your manager, or maybe it is your manager, it can be different people, who can orient you and help you plan for your next step or the future or where you're heading is really important, because it'll give you some direction. I think that's the biggest change when you graduate and go into the real world, where there isn't a syllabus, there isn't like a career plan. You're just kind of floating in this job, and you know, maybe you'll get promoted. Maybe if it's a very structured company, there's just a natural way that will happen. But if you're somewhere less structured, it's up to you. It's something that you have to push forward and organize and take some control over. So feedback is a fundamental part of that, and making sure managers are busy. And I think, unfortunately, there aren't a whole lot of good managers out there, because a lot of managers end up in their jobs just because they got promoted and nobody really taught them how. It's also not a skill that is natural. I don't think I've ever met anybody who just happened to be a good manager. It's not a natural skill as a human to manage other humans. I mean, maybe even parenting might be close, but even that's something hard that nobody knows how to do. You just kind of are thrown into it, I suppose. And so managing people often is something that you become as you get promoted, but then not that many places coach people into how to become managers or teach them those skills really well. And so managers sometimes think they're just around to distribute the work, and that's just about it. When in reality, a fundamental part of a manager's job is to coach and mentor and ensure the success of their team. So if you have a manager who is not as good at that, it is also important for you to get that feedback and not just wait for your manager to get you a grade at the end of the year. Ask that manager, what do I need to do to get to the next level? What does success look like in this role? Like, what can I do for you to really trust my work or trust me on this new project? And work with that person so that you can continue to improve and be better, and it's not a surprise at the end of the year. So the second one, communication, especially written. I think remote work has made this even more important, because a lot of jobs will be on something like Slack or Microsoft Teams, as opposed to being able to just swing by somebody's desk. So communication is very important in general, and then it's become more important now, where in remote work over Zoom, it's hard to do, and then over writing, it's even harder to get your point across or understand what somebody's asking. And learning how to do that well will be very helpful in not just asking questions and getting your point across, but also in working effectively with team members. And so when you're asking for guidance, provide context. When you need materials, provide context. Be empathetic. Think about, what does the other person need to know or need to access to be able to do this well? You know, if you were in that person's shoes, what would you need? And so being able to do that in general, just from an empathy and like interaction basis, but then being able to do that in a writing setting is also really important. The next one is understanding working styles. I think this is both understanding others, but also your own. Because if you understand your own, it goes a long way to be able to share that with whoever you work with. I think one of the things that I did that was really good, I did sort of by luck, I suppose. Wasn't really thinking about this, but when I hired my analyst, one of the first things I thought would be useful was like telling him how I normally work. And we don't normally do it with other team members, but in this case, since he was working so closely with me, I figured that would be important. And so I had to sit down and think about, how do I work? And so so you need to do a little bit of introspection. Are you more verbal? Do you really need to talk out problems with somebody to get your brain working? Are you more written, where you'd rather have somebody send you, a bunch of instructions and details on an email or some other way where you can process things? Are you a person that needs to be given a project and then some time to think about it and then have questions, a week from now, versus immediate questions? Like, that's something that I realized early in my career that I struggled with, where was asking questions as soon as I was given an ask, which is, I think, a weird, not something that is discussed as something somebody might struggle with, I suppose, but there's always this thing of like, ask a lot of questions, especially in finance. And I never had questions. And it's not that I wasn't thinking, but I guess my brain preferred to take a couple of days or maybe take some time to go over the work. And then I'd have a couple of questions, or I'd figure it out on my own, and then I'd ask really hard questions that I couldn't figure out on my own. But then what did that come off as? That came off as me not being engaged or not being communicative, whereas all the other analysts around me are asking all these random questions that maybe the questions aren't that good, that they could have just Googled themselves, or if they thought a little bit, maybe they could have resolved. But if you're able to communicate that to your manager or to your team, they'll understand that it's not that you don't have questions and you don't care about the work, but that your brain just doesn't work that way. And I think asking how other people work goes a long way, because it'll give you context in, maybe you're working with a team member who really doesn't like to talk, but is very good at writing very detailed ways to do things. And so if you understand that, you won't be frustrated if, you know, the other team member doesn't want to really get on a call or talk to you, but they, you know, maybe they're great and they actually have all these great resources that will help you do work. And so understanding your own working style, asking how others work, goes a long way in building that empathy and communication, and will help you navigate projects with different people. Another skill is working independently. I think this has become, again, more important with remote work, where you can't just drop into your team member's desk or office and ask for things. I think working independently, being self-driven and self-reliant, is both good in our current environment, but also good in general, because it means that your managers won't need to handhold as much, and also you'll feel you'll be trusted more, and you won't feel micromanaged. Nobody likes being micromanaged and feel like their manager is telling them exactly how to do everything. And the best way to build that trust is to learn how to work independently. Take a project, sort of like organize it yourself, learn how to prioritize on your own, and then maybe come back with questions in a timely fashion that your manager can support you with, and not need as much hand holding, and make sure to have an open mind to learning, right? And so take a lot of notes. If you're working on something that is done multiple times, like say you are producing a report that is done at the end of the month every month, you know, write down how you do those steps so you're not asking the same questions over and over again, and you can just sort of self-automate this process for yourself, and it'll mean like you spend less time sort of hassling somebody else, but it also means that you're going to be trusted with other things that you can do on your own fairly easily. Professional growth. So professional growth, I think, is the other pillar of skill sets. So continued improvement. I just mentioned, you know, if you get feedback, if you are doing something that you do often or repetitively, jot down the steps. If you get feedback, write it down. Think about ways where you can prevent the mistake the next time. So being sort of having that attitude of self-growth and self-improvement will help a lot, because it means that you'll be able to have less mistakes, produce better quality work, and that'll reflect in how much you're trusted and how your work is perceived by others. Curiosity goes a little bit with the concept of understanding the bigger picture, right? I think especially if you're in a startup where so many things are going on, it's usually very interesting. Asking other team members why, like, how the business works, how the engineering works, it'll help you build context. I think another example, so my analyst studied law and business as an MBA and a JD, knows nothing about engineering, but he does have to write legal documents around the engineering and around our products. And so he wouldn't be able to do that effectively if he didn't take some time to ask, hey, how does our product work? What is an API? what is web scraping? And so he asks all those questions, and from myself, from my co-founder, from the engineers, and that means that he can do his job even better because he actually understands what he's talking about. So being curious will be helpful, but also it'll open new doors. Like maybe you start off in one job and you realize that somebody else is doing something really cool and you can learn about it, and that's a potential door you never thought about. And so being curious about what people do and how your company works is going to be a great way to grow professionally. Ongoing learning. So learning, the ability to learn independently and interest in continuing to learn is actually something we interview for. So one of our interview questions is, when was the last time you took a class, any class, or learned something on your own? Online, Duolingo, could be an art class, could be a dance class, could be a programming class, anything. Like learning is a very, is a cornerstone part of our culture. So when we actually offer Coursera credits as part of our benefits. We learning, we have a learning club, and we also do talks every 3 weeks where 2 team members will either talk about their master's thesis or law or something they like happen to know a lot about, and teach the whole team. So ongoing learning for our particular case is very important, but for professional growth is a good way to keep your skills fresh. It turns out that now it seems that Whitman is looking into teaching students about SQL and Python, because now everything's about data and programming. And so skills keep changing. And so it used to be Excel, like 10 years ago, it was like everybody needs to learn Excel really well. Now we've moved on to a new era where Python's really important, SQL is very important. And so ongoing learning and getting into that habit is going to be a way to stay fresh in your career and stay up to date and be able to continue to be adaptable when roles change and industries change and requirements change over time. The last one I have here is aligning expectations. So what the company and your manager think of as growth and success and what you think of as growth and success has to be aligned. If you think you're learning something really well and your manager doesn't know you're learning that, or if your manager was hoping to teach you something and you don't realize that this is something you're supposed to be learning or that would be helpful for you to learn, you won't go in the direction, especially if you want to, grow within an organization. And so being very aware of what the expectations are, not just for your role, but maybe the next role up or the role you'd like to transition into, is pretty important. And it's important for you to ask what those are, ask how you can get there, and incorporate that as you start to move through an organization. The other thing I would add is they're actually very important when you start a new job. A lot of jobs you sort of get dropped in there, and then maybe we'll give you a project and it'll be a few months and you really don't know if you're doing well or not. So something that we do at MTOR is we do something called a 30, 60, 90. And so every new team member gets, with their onboarding, a document that has about 5 to 7 or 8 bullets per section on the things that they should have accomplished or understood by the first 30 days, the first 60 days, and the first 90 days. And that, the first few days of a job are very disorienting, but that gives them a very clear path of what they should be doing. It also keeps management honest, because sometimes you hire somebody with the expectation of giving them some job and then they're doing something completely different. And so you hire somebody to do A, and then it turns out for whatever reason you end up doing B and C, but then at the end of the year they'll evaluate you on A. And there's really if there wasn't that alignment, there's no way to know that they were still expected to do A, or that your managers should probably have changed what they were looking for to the new things that you were doing. So that goes in hand with the feedback and asking for feedback proactively and often, but also what is expected of you in this time frame, if your role changes, make sure to realign those expectations and make them very clear so that you and your managers are on the same page of what is good performance and what is success. I think that would be, and that is sort of like my last skill, I would say. I know I spoke a mouthful, but I think dividing them into 3 pillars of how you work with others, how you get better, and how you do really good work is I think is a good, something that I think applies very much to a corporation, but also definitely applies to a startup where you have to be very self-driven to be able to grow and do well. Cool. Any questions?
I have a quick question, Oriana. Thanks so much for talking to us. So I'm curious about the transition you made from a massive company to go into grad school to go into a startup. So what were some of the main factors that went into your decision? And then when did you know that it was time to make the change?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think graduate school is a very personal decision. I think it's a bit of a mistake to do grad school when you're bored of your job and you don't know what to do. I think some people tend to do that. Grad school, depending on what you're doing, but say an MBA, for example, which might be something that a lot of Whitman students might consider at some point. They're very expensive. They're 2 years that you're not in the job market, that you're maybe learning skills which you're not sure you want or need, aside from the fact that they're expensive. And so I think for graduate school, it's a very personal decision, and it's a decision on, do I want this particular skill set? Do I want to change into this particular industry? So for my case, I wanted a technical skill set. I had dabbled in programming for a long time since I was pretty young. Computer science is very broad. From there, you can do data science, quantitative trading, software engineering, work at a startup. And so that's what I was looking for. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I did was not take my GRE my senior year or shortly after graduating, because the GRE book that I bought, I think I bought a GRE book something like May or March 2013. So about a year after I graduated. I took the GRE to apply to graduate school over 2 years later. So never studied for it. It just kind of sat around collecting dust. Like the edition was old. I couldn't even use it anymore. GREs and GMATs are good for a few years. I think 3 or 5, I forget which one's which. And so if you are fresh out of undergrad and you're used to studying and you've done a lot of the content, doing it shortly after or your senior year, like my senior year, I think my last semester I took golf. I should have just studied for the GRE. Like that was stupid. Like I really should have done that and just had my GRE ready to go when I wanted to pull the trigger on the application to graduate school, because that was a huge blocking factor to get over to be able to apply anywhere. So I always knew I wanted to go. I knew I wanted to do something very technical. I wanted to do something that I didn't have the opportunity to study before or do on my own. And so computer science made sense for me. For like an MBA, I was already in banking. I was already doing quantitative finance, kind of. There was nothing new. I had worked in finance for almost 4 years. And so the MBA wasn't going to give me a VP title. I would have just been an associate anyways. And so it wouldn't have advanced me at all. It would have maybe just held me back a year, even from a professional perspective in banking, at least. I mean, consulting is similar. You just come back as an associate, unless you do an executive MBA on the weekends or something like that. And then from there to a startup, I had been kind of itching to do something independent toward the end of my time at JP Morgan. Then MTOR was born around the time I left, and I decided to join full-time after graduating. What really convinced me was that at a big company, especially when you are working a lot, the marginal return to that effort is a slightly bigger bonus at the end of the year, or maybe an early promotion. And when you work in investment banking or something very demanding, like maybe consulting at like a McKinsey, all those hours and those years for really weren't paying off in terms of me learning or being compensated or growing professionally. I think when I stopped learning was probably the biggest problem, because in the end, when you're learning, that's human capital, right? That's like sort of unseen compensation, because those are skills that you're taking with you for later on. And when you stop learning, it feels like all those hours and effort aren't really paying off in any way. Additionally to that, there's sort of this concept of equity in your time. So 4 years at JP Morgan, it's not like it really impacted the stock or changed anything significantly. Whereas 4 years, grinding at a startup where you happen to have equity or something like that, you have much more impact in what is happening with that business than you would do if your employee number, 250,000 at JP Morgan. Like the only person who really has impact is like Jamie Dimon and like the 5 other people under him, and nothing else really matters. So I think that became more and more obvious for me, and I had spent 4 years there, and I really wanted to make sure that all the extra effort and time being put in was going to have leverage and produce something that that I felt was proportional to that effort. Any other questions?